number 7 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Industry and Technology, pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Wednesday, January 26, 2022. The committee is meeting to study the ongoing work of the Canadian Radio Television Commission. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of November 25, 2021. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Pour ceux qui sont en personne à Ottawa, je vous invite.
For those here in person in Ottawa, I invite you to apprise yourselves of the health measures in place. Today, we have with us Mr. Ian Scott, Chairperson and Chief Executive Officer, Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission. He's accompanied by Anthony McIntyre, General Counsel and Deputy Executive Director, and Philip Kent, Director, Telecommunication Services Policy. Without further ado, I'm giving you the floor, Mr. Scott.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was going to start by introducing myself and my colleagues. You just did that, so I will get right to it. Nous apprécions l'occasion de.
We appreciate the opportunity that you gave us to speak to the work being done by the CRTC. Our objective is to encourage competition and investment in the market so that Canadians have access to broadband and wireless services that they need.
And the committee's concerns about the affordability of these vital services for the Canadian population, and we share those concerns. We've been working to implement a policy that is intended to foster competition among internet service providers in the marketplace. Now, much has been said about the decision we issued in May of 2021, which set the final wholesale rates for aggregated high-speed broadband access services. And before I speak about the substance of this decision, I do want to make clear that this was a costing decision, not a policy decision, and it's important that we get the rates right. Now, why did we reverse course? To put it simply, because we got the original initial decision wrong. We couldn't move ahead with rates that we knew were erroneous. While we always strive to get things right, the CRTC is not infallible. Legislators, parliamentarians anticipated this and included provisions in the Telecommunications Act that enable decisions to be reviewed by the Commission, by Cabinet, and by the courts as a mechanism to ensure that the public interest is protected. And in accordance with those provisions, companies submitted applications asking us to review our 2019 decision, as is their right. We addressed those requests seriously, fairly, and in an impartial manner, as we always do in our role as a quasi-judicial administrative tribunal. We built a public record and gathered evidence from interested parties. And when we analyzed that evidence, we found errors and could no longer justify the associated rates from the earlier decision. Ultimately, we chose to reaffirm and make final the interim rates that were set in 2016 with certain adjustments. The Commission's work to implement its wholesale access policy continues. There are numerous ongoing proceedings that are looking at the regime that are open and ongoing today, relating to our costing methodologies, barriers to the deployment of broadband, and more. Now, while I fully acknowledge that the new rates are creating challenges for some competitors, I am confident that we have done the responsible thing. I would stress also that the 2019 rates were never in effect in the marketplace. It is true that some competitors lowered their retail rates on the basis of that decision, but that was a business decision and a risk that they assumed given the appeals that were being filed at the time. Si une plus grande concurrence entre les fournisseurs des services.
While greater competition among broadband providers will benefit Canadians, there are far too many areas of the country that still do not have access to adequate or affordable broadband. That is why the CRTC is working to close Canada's digital divide. Through our broadband fund, the CRTC has committed more than $186 million to date to improve broadband services for about 30,000 households in 160 underserved and unserved communities. This includes a significant number of Indigenous communities. We continue to evaluate proposals, and we will announce new projects as they are approved. Finally, let me conclude by giving you an update on our mobile wireless decision, which we issued last April. Among other things, our decision created a mobile virtual network operator regime for Canada. It opens the door for service providers to access the wireless networks of the big three national carriers, Bell, Rogers, and TELUS, as well as SaskTel in Saskatchewan. We are currently in the process of establishing the associated terms and conditions of this access.
Consumers will benefit from a market for mobile wireless services that features more providers, more choice, and more affordable options and more investment. In addition, we took action to ensure Canadians can sign up for low cost and occasional use plans. So I hope my remarks have helped to clarify the work the CRTC is currently doing to support more competition and investment in the marketplace, to ensure Canadians have access to high quality broadband and wireless services, and as we always do, regulate in the public interest. We'd be pleased to answer your questions. Before we do, however, I must qualify my remarks by saying that we are unable to delve into specifics about any files that are currently before the Commission. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, and we're available for your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scott. And we're ready to start our first round. Just as a reminder for MPs and to inform our witnesses, when I present this yellow card, it means there's 1 minute left, and this red card, it means time is up. So we'll start right now with Madame Gray for 6 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of the witnesses for being here. Mr. Scott, you had referenced the scrapping of the plan to mandate lower wholesale internet rates, and I'm wondering if you can tell the committee today who made this recommendation back in May of 2021. Was it the CRTC's recommendation to the government, or was it the government recommending it to the CRTC?
As I just was explaining in my opening remarks, we didn't scrap the decision. The original decision, the rates that were contained in the 2019 decision were put on hold while we reconsidered the 2016 rates. Sorry. I am misspeaking. The 2019 decision were subject to appeals, and they were put on hold. Now, if the question is who made the decision, the CRTC. We're an arm's length independent agency from government. The decision was taken by the members based on the public record of the proceeding.
Great. Thank you very much. Mr. Scott, how many internet service providers did the CRTC consult with specifically on reversing or putting this on plan or on hold, as you were saying, to drop the wholesale internet rates?
We don't consult with individual companies. We issue a public notice, a notice about proceedings, and then parties are free, any party, any Canadian is free to intervene in the process. There is both an association that represents many internet service providers, as well as numerous individual providers have been involved throughout all of the proceedings relating to the establishment of terms and conditions for wholesale access, as well as the establishment of the rates through several
Thank you. I've got
proceedings.
limited time, so I think you've answered that. Thank you kindly.
Okay.
The next question is, Mr. Scott, were there any telecommunication companies or individuals that were notified in the sector prior to this decision becoming public that this would be putting on hold?
No, and again, when I say put on hold, they were subject to appeals. The court stayed the decision because of appeals made by numerous parties to the Federal Court of Appeal. They issued a stay, which meant the decision did not take effect. Meanwhile, parties also appealed to us and appealed to the federal cabinet. But to the specific question, no one gets advice or advised or communicated commission decisions in advance of their publications. We're a quasi-judicial tribunal.
Has the CRTC done any analysis on how the record-breaking inflation that we have seen may affect the affordability of internet for Canadians?
We track and monitor prices and general economic conditions regularly. We report on that. There's a place on our website where you'll see communications reports, including detailed information about rates and plans and offerings. So in that sense, and then otherwise, arguments or submissions are made in the context of various proceedings, and that evidence is taken into account as we deliberate on any given matter.
What metrics are you using? I mean, we know that inflation is a huge issue right now. So, are there any specific metrics that you're using when you take this into consideration?
As I said, we have a number of proceedings going on, and evidence will be led in those proceedings. And that's the information, and only that information is used to base any decisions. What I was describing was our regular monitoring of the industry available to Canadians, available to companies, and so on. But specific to the decision-making process, parties are free to submit evidence and information, and that is what we rely on.
Great, thank you, Mr. Scott. Now, are you able to table any analysis the CRTC may have on this that you use in your considerations?
I have no separate information. As I said, there is extensive general information about telecommunications pricing services and so on available on our website. Otherwise, our decisions are speak for themselves. They are published and readily available, as are any reports that we commission. But
Right.
there is no other separate analysis.
So, but my understanding is that you came to the decision to, to use in your words, to put this on hold, and you know that you get submissions and you sort of look through and look at inflation as one of them. So, I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is what specific analysis are you using to come to that decision? Is there, what specific metrics are you using to come to that decision? What can you table for the committee today to make us better understand how you're coming to that decision?
So that decision, it was, to be clear now, the rates were not put on hold. They were stayed by the courts. The decision is the establishment of final rates. And everything that has any bearing on that process is contained in the decision itself. So we'd be happy to provide the full decision to the members. That is the only statement and that is what we relied on. All of the information, and it is properly accounted for and published in the decision. So we'd be pleased to provide that to the committee if they don't have it.
Thank you, Mr. Scott and Madam Gray. I will now turn to Mr. Erskine-Smith for 6 minutes.
Thanks very much, Joelle, and happy birthday. Mr. Scott, just so I have the timeline right, so May 2015, there's a notice of consultation for wholesale rates. March 2016, there's an interim decision that determined that wholesale rates were likely not just or reasonable. A comprehensive review was undertaken for over 3 years. Comprehensive review, by the way, is not my language. That's the language from the August 15th, 2019 decision. And that comprehensive review, despite its comprehensiveness, was incredibly incorrect, I guess, because less than 2 years later, you reversed course almost entirely. How did you get it so wrong? And how can we have confidence in your continued work if after 3 years of a comprehensive review, you get it so completely wrong?
I'm not sure what the question is. The work of the committee. First, perhaps I should take a step back, if I may, and just explain that costing processes. This is use of long run incremental cost by regulators to help establish rates, for example, in this case, wholesale rates for competitors. These are measures that are used around the world by regulators to try and establish rates of this type. It's a very complex process. To give you a sense of the sort of size and scope of that material, we were dealing with something like 150 costing models, 20,000 pages of evidence, over 100 rate elements to be calculated. And all of those are, if you will, contested. On the one side, you have parties submitting rates and defending their representation of the appropriate costing, and others contesting it and asking for changes. So a long story short, staff and the commissioners rendered a decision they believed to be correct. As I said earlier, following an application for review and vary, we conducted a thorough analysis. We sought additional information from all parties, and based on that record, we identified errors. And having identified them, we're duty bound to correct them.
Determined that great errors were made. The challenge, though, of course, is you've got companies that are assuming risks. You're right. They're assuming risks. They're making business decisions with the confidence that you're getting a comprehensive review right after over 3 years. And so to I think, flippantly sort of say, well, they assumed risk, that fundamentally the decision undercuts competition. And your mandate, I would hope, is to encourage competition. So let me get to another element of competition around MVNOs, because I can't figure this one out either. March 2017, this is before your time. In fairness, CRTC makes a decision, incorrectly in my view, to say no to MVNOs. Referred back by the Governor and Council, and April 15th, 2021, a very modest step forward. And what I can't figure out, because other jurisdictions have a business model, I've met with a company that operates internationally with this business model. They want to build towers. They want to build the infrastructure. And they'll let other companies operate on their infrastructure. And there are two business models. One, the company that builds the tower, and other companies that want to operate on the tower. And everyone can make money and their own piece of the pie. And we don't want to take that step forward despite other jurisdictions operating in this fashion. Why not?
The answer to that question can be found in the Commission's decision from, I guess it's April of last year, following a fulsome review of the wireless sector. I would like.
You think you got that fulsome review right?
I do, and there's to be entirely accurate. A result of that framework is that we have indeed introduced MVNOs. We introduced MVNOs that are available to any company that has spectrum that can be used for mobile services. And we fully expect that process to not only continue competition, but enhance competition by the very players who have entered the market and are having a meaningful impact on rates.
Last question is specific to your position and in relation to the meeting you had, which is public now. You did a recent interview at the Toronto Star in relation to the meeting, and you indicated that the CEO of Bell is a friend. And I wonder, does it not give you pause knowing that the decisions you make are so consequential for companies in this space, but for Canadians who care about affordability of an essential service in this space, which depends in some ways on increased competition, not necessarily friendly to Bell and the big three? Does it not give you pause to have meetings like that?
The approach the Commission takes, fellow Commissioner, staff, with respect to meetings is grounded in well-established rules. Our meetings are recorded, meetings are required by parties, for example, with me, to be reported through the lobbyist registration process, as they are, I assume, with all of you.
Can I pause just because I have a good question on that front? Dwayne Winsick, a professor, said the CRDC has refused to let policy analysts visit his university class because of perceived conflicts of interest. How do I square that statement that he's made and the feedback he's gotten with having a beer with the CEO of Bell?
I have no idea what context you just raised that latter point is. I have spoken at classes at the University of Ottawa, University of Victoria, at Ryerson during my term. I have never dictated who could and could not attend. That is a matter for the university and the professor. So I have no idea to what you're referring. As to the meeting, I meet with everyone pursuant to the rules. I meet with the heads of consumer groups, with individual Canadians, with small broadcasters, with members of parliament. We meet as we must as a public body, and we follow the rules.
Merci, Monsieur Scott, Monsieur Erskine-Smith. C'est tout le temps qu'on avait. Je passerai maintenant la...
Thank you. Now, Mr. Lemire, 6 minutes. Thank you. Thank you. Allow me, first of all, to address myself to you and to thank you for your boldness, for your statement today. I thank you for that. Mr. Scott, thank you for your being here today. And your decisions brought us to have some questions over the year in the context of an election. And now today we're here today, but there's a lot of courage in your decision, and I'd like to note that. I'd like to ask you a question. Did the COVID-19 pandemic allow you to reflect on a Canadian telecommunication strategy and to see that an answer has to be provided with regards to internet access, where the need is mostly in regions, and not only for citizens in large urban centers? There might be several questions in your one question. Could I answer in English, Mr. Lemire?
I'm trying to think how is the pandemic have a profound impact on our processes or our direction in terms of bridging the digital divide? The answer is absolument oui, absolutely yes. It has never been more obvious and important in Canada and throughout the world to ensure that all Canadians have access to reliable broadband service. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we have a fund, but also all levels of government, municipal, provincial, territorial, have all been doubling their efforts and frankly, doubling the amount of funds available to extend the service. But it remains, c'est encore un problème très complexe.
This is still a very important and complex problem. Right now, I think that in Canada, there are about 70% of the population that has access to broadband internet, and about 50%, though, in rural areas. In smaller towns.
Rural areas.
Yes, in rural Canada. And so what's more, for Indigenous communities, it's about 30% that have access to broadband. So this is a huge issue. And
all levels of government are trying to address it.
J'ai apprécié dans vos propos préliminaires.
In your opening statements, I appreciated when you were talking about competition, access to the market, affordability, but also all this issue around access. It's part of the message. When I was elected 2 years ago, I didn't feel this as much. And now we recognize that we need a competition, we need an infrastructure. So the new mobile virtual networks that were defined by the CRTC, do you have incentives for regional companies, especially in poorly served regions? Will there be improvement here?
That is the nature of the framework. The logic of that framework is that the if you will, new entrants, the providers who have been building out in most parts of Canada are best positioned to compete with the three large national wireless providers. And what that framework does is it will allow them to expand more quickly and frankly to compete more aggressively with the three national providers.
Le nerf de la guerre à partir de maintenant.
So right now, it seems that the crux of the issue is to see what are the modalities that will allow to open up negotiations between the network owners. For example, what are these modalities that will know who are the players to allow for better negotiation? If I understand, negotiation has ended. Are we talking about weeks or months here? I'll ask my colleague, Mr. Kent, to respond. He's working on the file. But I'd like to repeat what I was saying at the end of my statement. We're not able to speak much on this subject.
S'il vous plaît,
Phil, could you please speak to the process? Yes, thank you. So we're reviewing them with different modalities. Businesses have suggested some terms. We have looked at this, and now we have asked questions. We've received answers at the end of January. So we are reviewing the file. But this being said, it will be several weeks before a decision is made, and the businesses can, if they want, begin negotiations and provide service now if they want. We've seen that there's not necessarily any interest at the present time. So we're going to have to go through the different modalities. You only have 15 seconds left. Okay. Yes, I see that. You know that on the field, things are happening differently. If we're talking about months, I would like to insist that it's urgent to act, that everyone should have internet access and should have these modalities. This should allow people to negotiate between themselves and establish connections in the regions. It's really important. I hope you act quickly. Thank you.
Merci.
Merci, Monsieur Lemire. Je passe.
Thank you, Mr. Lemire.
Mr. Chair, I don't think it's that complicated. We really have an industry here that is entirely regulated. I'm a former city councillor, and you don't get access to, the infrastructure without conditions and terms. Federally, we have a spectrum auction, and we own the airwaves. We own the air rights. So we're at a point right now where it's failed us colossally, like in a huge way. Because even before the pandemic, there was a lot of problems for access. So, Mr. Scott, I just want to, where would you, find some type of, options for us to enhance either programs, which I don't like because I disagree with the government's, the previous one and this one, with regards to how they actually auction off the spectrum. But how do we actually use the tools that we have right now to connect Canadians in a way that's actually affordable? Because it's not fair right now. We have kids trying to do school. Some are doing remotely. Some are actually, in urban centers. Then we have all kinds of businesses and a whole series of different things. But where can we actually improve in the short term some of the structures that are working really well versus that of actually remolding the CRTC, which you may disagree with, and that's fine, but which I think needs to be done?
I won't comment on the latter point. Not my place. And where to begin? So the first thing I would say is, and I know you are well aware of this, we don't regulate retail rates. And the Telecommunication Act says that we ought not to unless there is no other choice. And regulation, that kind of detail rate regulation, left most advanced economies in the late 1990s or even early 1990s. And you move more to various forms of incentive regulation and so on. The driver for lower rates and better service is competition. And the CRTC's approach, and again, you know that we don't regulate spectrum. That is a matter for the industry department, so I won't try and answer for them. But we've focused on competitive models. And there is competition, and competition has produced some desirable results. When we talk about wireless, we have excellent coverage in Canada. We have the latest technology. We have not done as well on rates. And so the Commission's work has been focused on trying to enhance competition. Through various means, a number of entrants have entered the market. And in our recent examination of the marketplace and our recent framework, accelerate that competition to drive down those rates. Now, with respect to the specific measures in relation to affordability, we have targeted some measures to low-income Canadians. The government has introduced some programs. They recently, as you alluded to generally, they recently enhanced, if you will, a program for internet access. That's $20 for a 5010 service for qualifying Canadians, and they expanded those criteria beyond the original child benefit, but also to other lower income Canadians. But if you don't have detailed rate regulation, then we can't direct specific rates for specific target markets. But I think in fairness, the ultimate answer is we need to continue to enhance competition. That's what's going to drive down rates and meet the needs of consumers.
Okay, and one of the other things that I do want to ask you about, and to get at a kind of a perspective in terms of resourcing, one of the biggest complaints that I get is the time duration for CRTC decisions. And without, I'm not going to, get into the details, but for yourself and your team, like what would we have to do resource-wise to either escalate the time decision process, and if we mandated a date for time, what complications would that have in terms of windows, so people know and businesses know when a decision will make?
It's a fair question, and I could argue with the premise in terms of long time, but certain things do take a long time. We've talked quickly about the wholesale access, and that is a very long period of time. And it is because of the costing, the nature of the costing exercise, and the nature of the number of parties, and the fact that a large process that's being contested. When you have large policy proceedings like the wireless proceeding, then you need to gather evidence from all parties, and then have public hearings and then examine the record. You could add resources and it would incrementally change and improve the timing, but fundamentally we do remain a transparent quasi-judicial agency that follows administrative law principles. So that means we can only rely on the information filed with us. We encourage all Canadians to participate, and then we have to examine that large record. We're not slower than other regulators dealing with similar issues. And some of them are complex and take a long time. So I do understand it's frustrating, but it also reflects the significance, economic and business significance of the matters that we're deciding on.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Maas, Monsieur Scott. Je passerai maintenant la parole.
Thank you, Mr. Généreux. Mr. Scott, did the Council of Ministers try to influence the decision that was made on wholesale price setting in 2019?
Oui, en fait, le Conseil des ministres.
The Council of Ministers or some businesses.
Based solely on the record of the proceeding. So we put out a notice, parties file evidence, we hold hearings in certain cases, and that's what we base our decision on, nothing else.
Mais ma question est, est-ce que le Conseil des ministres, d'une façon...
Did the Council of Ministers try to influence your decision? No. When you made the decision in May to overturn the 2019 decision, what changed in the competitive landscape to reverse the decision in a short period of time? When we look at the time it takes normally for decisions to be made at the CRTC, we can say that this was a short period of time to reverse. You said it was you spoke about a mistake. What mistakes were made? Why did you have to reverse your decision? I will ask my colleague to speak to the details. Generally speaking, as to these mistakes. But first of all, I will say that it's not a policy change. It's a decision on costing that was made.
Phil, could you just briefly describe the process of review and the areas? Mais finalement,
In the end, it's the decision is made by the Commission.
In the decision. Phil?
Oui, merci.
Thank you. As was indicated, a large number or a lot of information, of briefs were made in the context of the rate review. Staff needs to do an analysis on this cost model that exists for each business offering wholesale, high-speed wholesale service. A lot of analyses were conducted. There's a lot of detail involved. Many questions were asked of these businesses. And this data was reviewed and reviewed and reviewed over again. And officials that worked on the file did their very best and did a complete analysis and made a recommendation to the members that there were some mistakes. And these mistakes were based on the fact that there's such a large number of elements that have to be taken into consideration during a rate review. So, Mr. Scott, the perception among the public about people who have positions such as ours, the perception is often different than reality. Your meeting with Bell executive in the Bar of Ottawa can seem benign, but this meeting you were saying that meetings follow the CRTC rules, and when you meet with parties, everything is being taped. We can believe that there was no recording of your meeting in a bar. So what impact do you think this had on the independence of the CRTC? It became public afterwards, so we can talk about this publicly. Answer, yes, I understand.
I'll do this in English. Est-ce que je peux répondre
Pas
en
de
anglais?
problème, pas de problème.
Is that I have meetings with, whether it is Bell, Shaw, Rogers, the PIAC, consumer organizations. We follow the same process in all cases. So this has gotten a lot of attention, but it doesn't change the circumstances. We've discussed matters that are in front of the Commission with anyone at a meeting. And we hold meetings, and as you have said yourself, we follow the rules. They're reported in my agenda, and the parties report them. And we follow the rules.
Monsieur Scott, je suis pas sûr que ça...
Mr. Scott, I'm not sure this meeting was in your agenda, but the perception, you can see, I'd like to remind you that the perception of a meeting like that is very negative, and it reflects badly on your organization. Thank you, Mr. Généreux. I think that was a comment and not really a question, and that's all for your time. I will give the floor to Mrs. Lapointe. 5 minutes.
Mr. Scott, thank you for your time with us today. So last June, this committee tabled a report, and it was entitled Affordability and Accessibility of Telecommunication Services in Canada.
Désolé, Monsieur le Président, point d'ordre. Est-ce que maintenant... Oui, OK, c'est bon.
Okay. J'ai oublié, merci. Est-ce que vous m'entendez maintenant?
Oui.
OK.
So last June, this committee tabled a report, and it was entitled Affordability and Accessibility of Telecommunication Services in Canada, Encouraging Competition to Bridge the Digital Divide. And the committee noted, and this is a direct quote from that report, that there is still a major digital divide between urban areas and rural and remote regions, and that the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated the need to get all Canadians connected as quickly as possible, no matter where they live. So since this report of last year, can you tell us and update us on what are some of the steps the CRTC is taking to help improve connectivity for those in rural, northern, and Indigenous communities?
As I mentioned in my opening remarks, and let me just take a step back and say I completely agree with the committee's recommendation and statement, and I quickly tried to point out, I think, where we are right now, which is, it's a little more than half of the, if you will, urban is about 90% have available to them 50-10, but it's around 50%. In the case of those in rural areas, and sadly, less again in Indigenous communities. So what are we doing about it? We initiated our broadband fund for our part, and we have been assessing applications and awarding projects funding as rapidly as we can. We work together to the extent we can as an arm's length agency with federal and provincial governments to make sure that taxpayer dollars are being deployed efficiently. And obviously the federal, provincial, and territorial governments have now committed much larger amounts of funding to try and build those things out. And progress is being made. I note that I think it was about 44% a year, 18 months ago in rural areas. We don't have the most recent numbers, but it looks like it's greater than 50%. That's not a great result, but it is, it is happening. And it does take time. The reason those rural communities are less well served is typically fiber doesn't reach them. And fiber is being deployed in a lot of cases, as well as new technologies such as low orbit satellites. So all of these things are happening, and they're not happening fast enough, I acknowledge, for those who live in those areas with less, a lower or insufficient level of service. But directionally, it's going to the right place, and we're doing what we can with our fund.
Okay. So during the study last year, Daniel Goldberg, who's the president CEO at Telesat, told the committee about Telesat's activities and broadband in rural and remote regions. And he noted that the current satellites are too deep in space to provide high capacity and low latency service, and that Telesat had some plans to develop a network of low Earth orbit satellites. I think the term is LEOs, to increase its satellite-based internet capacity. So this would give users access to broadband services equivalent to fiber, as you were just speaking to, as well as wireless LTE and 5G services. Mr. Colbert said that he expected construction of these satellites to begin in early 2021 and the system to be ready for beta testing in 23. So can you tell us if the CRTC has seen evidence of this project developing and how a successful deployment of LEOs could change access for northern and rural communities?
We track all technical developments as best we can. We have been watching with great interest the announcements that have been made publicly about Telesat's progress as they've approved various network components and so on. We've also been watching the deployment of Starlink, SpaceX's service, and there is another one called OneWeb. So we are monitoring all of these as they do represent a potential source of similar connectivity and latency as do fiber, and may become a tremendous solution for very remote and northern areas. Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Madame Lapointe, Mr. Scott. And we now move to Monsieur Sébastien Lemire pour 2 minutes 30.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair, there was a change. I am going to ask the questions. Great. You have the floor. Mr. Champoux? Yes. Mr. Scott, I'd like to come back to another subject. I'm sure that you were made aware of the new version of the bill seeking to Bill C11. Yes, so I'm quite convinced that you've been reading it for several days last year. In C10, there was a section that was withdrawn that led to a controversy and probably contributed to the demise of this bill, and in Section 4.1. And then this was brought back in Bill C11. I'd like to hear your comments on the ways that this was written in the current version of the bill.
C'est pas une question.
Wow, this is not a question that I was expecting today.
That we may well be asked to appear before the Heritage Committee to discuss it. I have only had an opportunity to look briefly at the new legislation as tabled. What I would like to say perhaps about it is the discussion that I watched and heard at committee in relation to the predecessor bill C10 about 4.1 really went to how user-generated content would be treated. My understanding of the new legislation is it says user-generated content won't be unless it is subject to specific regulatory measures introduced by the CRTC.
Je vais vous interrompre un petit peu, Monsieur Scott, simplement pour...
I will interrupt you, Mr. Scott, to specify, to clarify my idea. This is a short period for questions. There is a section that speaks to shows that are subject to the Act, and there is a measure that you probably should apply that says that a show that comes from online that generates direct or indirect revenue should be submitted to regulation. Do you think then we won't have an issue in the interpretation as to the freedom of users of social media?
To be fair, I think that question, I would rather take an undertaking at this point and provide information to the committee. The legislation was only introduced last week. I don't have a role. We, the Commission, does not play a role in the development of legislation. I'm happy to answer questions about the Commission's role, but if I could, I would respond perhaps in writing to the committee or perhaps at,
Oui, je
there's an echo.
Je pense qu'il y a un petit écho, mais...
I think there's an echo. That was all the time. Thank you, Mr. Champoux. Now, Mr. Moss, 2.5 minutes.
Est-ce que Monsieur Moss, je pense...
Mr. Moss, is he here? I don't see him. We might come back. We might come back to him. Mr. Fast, 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. My questions are going to go back to wholesale rates, Mr. Scott. You said that the wholesale rate decision reversal was a costing decision, not a policy one, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
But in your May 27, 21 news release, the CRT said, and I quote, "This decision will enable the industry to move towards a new wholesale model that will increase competition and investments." Respectfully, Mr. Scott, that sounds like a policy decision. Have you moved to a new wholesale model?
I don't know if you would like me to get into details about the various models. There are two aspects to wholesale access that were established in 2016. One is called the aggregated model, one is called the disaggregated model. One is involves, if you will, the wholesale access of all services, and that was what the final rates were in the 2019.
Mr. Scott, I'm familiar with those two models, disaggregated and aggregated. I just want to know, have you moved to a new wholesale model? And was the decision actually a policy decision that you made to reverse your decision on wholesale rates?
As I've already answered, the decision to which you're referring is a costing decision, and it established final rates for aggregated and final rates and other technical elements for disaggregated, and other aspects of the wholesale regime are still in front of us.
Can you tell me, to what degree did the reversal have anything to do with improving the prospect that large telcos would invest further and to a greater degree in the infrastructure required to expand broadband across Canada, especially rural areas?
My colleague may want to correct me if I don't remember properly. I don't recall that being part of the record of the proceeding. As I said, this was focused on costing elements, not on policy considerations. I'm well aware that parties made submissions after in relation to court proceedings and before cabinet that related to their investments. But the decision that we are discussing related to costing, not to deployment of facilities.
Well, you mentioned the CRTC $750 million broadband fund. How much of that is taxpayers' money?
None. Well, unless you want to refer to, it comes from the industry. It's not a government program in the traditional sense. We do it similar to the contribution regime that was used to support the extension of basic telephone service.
All right.
Has been modified so that it now essentially supports the deployment of broadband services.
But fund,
it's derived from payments from carriers.
But Mr. Scott, that fund isn't the only government money that has gone into expanding broadband access across Canada, correct?
That's correct, but you asked me about the
yes.
$750
No.
million.
I agree. I'm not trying to be disingenuous here. Do you have any idea how much federal and provincial investment has gone into our broadband rollout across Canada since, say, 2015?
I don't have a number in front of me. I recall appearing in front of this committee with the then deputy of ISED, and we were asked what we thought it would take. I think this was 3 years ago, how much money it would take to extend broadband to all Canadians. And at the time, the estimate was in the area of $8 billion.
If I told you, Mr. Scott, that it's in excess of $11 billion, would you be surprised?
Of money that has been committed in principle or money spent? I'm not sure. I can't answer the question.
Well, I can tell you, if you look at the government records, it's at least $11 billion. Most of that funding actually goes to help our large telcos make those investments across Canada. And yet, here we are, we have a decision that you have made to reverse your initial decision, which lowered those wholesale rates, and you returned them to the 2016 rates, which were higher. And yet, it is these large telcos that, for the most part, receive the largest benefit of the public investments that are being made in our broadband systems across the country. And of course, those subsidies end up going to the bottom line of the big telcos. I mean, you look at Rogers' bottom line, TELUS's bottom line, Bell's bottom line, Shaw's bottom line. There are significant profits being made, and yet your organization made a decision to effectively make it more expensive for the small telcos to compete and provide Canadians with better pricing and better service.
Mr. Fast, I'm afraid that we're 30 seconds over time already, so perhaps Mr. Scott will have the chance to respond at a later point. I'll just go back to Mr. Moss for 2.5 minutes. Mr. Moss.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll let Mr. Scott respond to that. That's a good question, and Mr. Scott hasn't a chance to answer that, so please provide.
Thank you. I have to take issue with the premise. No, our decision was about costing, and it is important that we get the costs right. And it doesn't matter whether it's a large company or a small company. Our task in that case is to apply a costing methodology and to come up with a just and reasonable rate that reflecting the actual costs involved in providing the service. So that is what we did. And as we have already mentioned, we made an error and then it was corrected as it needed to be. With respect to the awarding of programs, I can't speak to other government programs. I can speak to the CRTC's awarding of projects. We do not favor one group or another. We have objective criteria, again, that was developed as a result of a fulsome process. We apply it fairly, impartially, and we award projects where no one has access to 5010 service. And we are doing our best to extend service in those remote areas. And we do not care via which technology or who it is, as long as they meet the criteria and improve service for Canadians.
That's pretty well my time. So thanks, Mr. Chair.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Maas.
Thank you, Mr. Maas. Mr. Dong, 5 minutes.
I hope you give me extra 30 seconds as well. That was a joke. But very good to meet you, Mr. Scott. I have two lines of questions. Let's start with scam calls. Scam calls are becoming a daily routine for many Canadians. And due to COVID, we've seen reports of increased use of this and more advanced technology as well. And, just this morning, I got 3 calls from Service Canada. Right. Mm-hmm. So, and we know that these are particularly harmful to newcomers and also our senior population. At the same time, it actually reduced credibility of our public institutions as well.
Yes.
I understand that there is a law enforcement part of the solution, but what is CRTC doing about this problem?
Well, thank you for the question. I'll try not to use up all of your time. We're doing as much as we can. It is truly a terrible problem, as much as I am working, we have agreements with the FCC and the Australian regulator and others, memorandums of understanding to work together to try and address it. Some of the measures that we've taken include blocking calls at source, what are called malformed numbers, things that are obviously not real numbers. And we've authorized the carriers to block those at source. We've introduced a system called Stir Shaken, which as it's applied will allow companies to indicate to consumers whether or not the call has been verified. We've also recently approved what was a trial to use artificial intelligence to identify and screen out some of these calls. But I do have to quickly add that, a couple of years ago when I looked at the numbers, we were talking on numbers something like 200,000 calls per second in the United States.
So sorry, Mr. Scott. So, addition to this issue we're talking about, has there been any requirement from CRTC to private companies and carriers? Because at the end of the day, we are as consumers paying for their services, right? So, are they under pressure to correct this phenomenon?
Yes, they are.
Okay.
We instructed them to do those things.
Okay, I want to get to my next question.
Yes.
So this CRTC is new to me and I'm a new member of INDU. As I'm learning about CRTC and its different functions. So on one hand, you administer government funding to partner up with carriers and to expand the broadband coverage infrastructure. On the other hand, you approve wholesale rates, and then you act as supervisor and regulator for the industry. And on top of that, you oversee the thousands of broadcasters. So do you find it challenging to kind of balance all these different hats? I'm asking this question in the context of Canadian customer are paying some of the highest rates in the world, right? So, the fact is that it sounds to me that there's a lot of responsibility on your shoulder, and at times there might be conflict when you have to make important decisions. I compare it to electricity system, which is equally complex. They have multiple regulators. each taking a part of the whole system. So in short, do you feel that maybe it's time for some change, or do you think it's too much responsibility on one agency?
I don't know that it's my place to talk about the future design of the CRTC. My short answer would be no. We are able to. We're a very competent organization. We have a very skilled staff.
So you never felt that there might be a sort of a potential situation with a potential conflict, whereas because there are only a few players in the market, right? So you're approving their wholesale rates, and then you may or may not work with them, carry out government programs, fundings, and whatnot. You never felt that there was a time for conflict.
No, we don't. Those are. I mean, we act impartially as an arm's length and quasi-judicial agency. No, I don't see any conflict.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you, Mr. Dung.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
Thank you. I have to excuse myself from the meeting. I have a border crisis in Windsor, and I apologize to our witnesses and our witness, and please allocate my time appropriately to anyone that would like it. And I apologize for the tips later on. And thank you very much. Sorry to disrupt the meeting.
It's completely understandable, Mr. Mas. Thank you. So I will now turn to Mr. Cram for 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I would like to welcome the witnesses from the CRTC to the committee today. When I go to the mall to buy a cell phone, there's always a Rogers store and a TELUS store and a Bell store. There's also a SaskTel store because I'm from Saskatchewan. But there's no AT&T, there's no Verizon, there's no T-Mobile. Why don't we open up the Canadian cell phone market to American competition?
First, I'd have to say that it's not the role of the CRTC to set government policy, but rather to regulate the Canadian industry. But I can offer you a comment if you wish. And that would be first that the market is not entirely closed. It is open in certain areas. And with respect to wireless, for example, carriers could come in as long as they don't have more than 10% market share. But you're correct if you're saying they can't come in and, for example, buy a TELUS or a Rogers, which may or may not be in the public interest. There would be other foreign investment reviews. But what we do have is what we are responsible for at the CRTC is to ensure that Canadian carriers that meet the regulations are indeed Canadian owned and controlled. That's as far as our jurisdiction goes.
And when you think of all of the laws and regulations that the CRTC has to implement, if we were to open up the marketplace to more foreign competition or more American competition, how big an undertaking would that be from the CRTC's perspective?
Again, I can only offer a comment. It wouldn't be a decision of the CRTC, but what I would say, and obviously well known to all of you, Canada's a large country geographically with a small population. We have facilities built out by several companies and now increasingly a number of new regional players and hopefully more again in the future. A company coming in and building in Canada will face all of the same challenges that are faced by, for example, the new regional entrants. It is costly to build a new network and costly to establish a brand and awareness and so on. But if they did so, we would have more competition. The Commission's approach is to make sure that we enhance competition that does exist today in Canada, and that's why we introduced MVNOs that will help support the emerging competitors to better compete with the large three national players who are dominant.
If an American carrier wanted to enter the Canadian marketplace, is there any reason why they could not be treated as any other regional carrier? And can you speak to some of the implications of that?
Not fully my area of expertise. If they were operating spectrum, they would have to get spectrum licenses from the industry department. If they were starting as a new carrier, they would have to abide by various CRTC regulations, providing alerting, providing 911, and so on. But otherwise, they'd be treated as any other entrant, provided they had less than 10% market share.
And I know when driving a car in Canada or the United States, all of our speedometers are in kilometers, and in the United States, they're in miles. Can you speak to any particular technical challenges that may exist if American carriers wanted to enter the Canadian marketplace?
None that leap to mind, and I could turn to my colleague to see if he wants to correct me when I finish. But essentially, the technologies that are being deployed in Canada are largely the same as those in the United States. Most of the major vendors are the same. Most of the standards are the same. So there's nothing obvious to me that is significantly different between the U.S. and Canada. Phil, am I missing something that?
No, I wouldn't add anything.
Thank you.
And could you speak to what effects this would have on competition in the marketplace and prices for consumers?
I'm not sure I can. Obviously, more competitors generally intensifies competition, assuming they're effective, and that would improve competition and presumably help lower prices. That's exactly what we're trying to do with the current the framework that we introduced last April.
Thank you, Mr. Scott and Mr. Cram. We are now going to Mr. Gahir for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the panelists. So my first question is, so in March of 2020, the government laid out the criteria for the 3 major wireless providers to reduce their rates by 25%. As we heard last week, the commitment to reduce rates by 25% has been met. How do we ensure that that momentum isn't lost and that affordable wireless plans continue to be available for Canadians?
As I mentioned earlier in one of my responses, we are carefully tracking wireless rates. That's different than perhaps than the government commitment and what they're following. That was a government initiative. For our part, what we're trying to do, what we are doing to make sure those rates keep going down is to continue to enhance competition. And I'm very confident that that framework that we introduced last year will have that effect. Rates have been going down. They've been going down steadily, and that is encouraging. They need to go down much more. And that is certainly what we hope the framework that we've introduced will contribute to.
Yeah, thank you. So my understanding was, and this was confirmed by you earlier, that the CRT doesn't intervene in the rates, in the quality of service for internet service providers as they relate to retail customers. And it's more of a lever on the wholesale rates. Are there any other levers that the CRTC has that can lead to reduced rates for the retail customer? Is there anything else that the CRTC can do?
I'm trying to think of something. I mean, the regulatory framework we put in place is meant to do that. When there is a case where there is market power, and then accordingly insufficient competition, and in this case higher rates than we would like to see, then if you don't use retail price regulation, you use wholesale measures, and that's what we've been doing. What else can you do, as governments are doing and we are doing? Try and ensure that more facilities are built, extending into unserved areas, but also overlapping existing carriers so that there's more competition between carriers, large and small.
Great. So in its June 2021 report on the affordability and accessibility of telecom services in Canada, the committee also highlighted the difficulty that multiple TSPs have in gaining access to support structures, such as utility poles. And the CRT pointed out that there are consultations that are underway to address this issue. Yes. What are what's the status of those consultations?
It's an ongoing process. I'm not sure if you're asking about timing. We don't say when decisions are coming out. The record, I'll ask my colleague Phil to just speak in a moment to where we are in the process. But I believe with respect to the proceeding that was looking at barriers to the deployment of broadband, I believe the record is complete and staff is conducting its analysis. But Mr. Kent, could you speak to that quickly for me?
Yeah, we have two ongoing proceedings. One with respect to barriers to broadband, another one that was specific to support structures and barriers to accessing support structures. Both those, the records are currently closed, and we're in the process of reviewing the submissions.
Great, thank you, Chair. Do I have more time, or?
Yes, you have a minute, at least a minute.
Yeah. So you guys also mentioned that just the competition would be the best way to reduce rates for the retail customers. But you also mentioned the barriers to entry in the Canadian market, that we have a small population, it's spread out over a large geographic area. What else could the CRTC do to increase competition, to sort of bring in maybe more foreign service providers into the Canadian market?
As I mentioned, I don't think the nationality of the competitor changes the economics. Mm-hmm. Whether it's a US company or a Canadian company, you need to build out your facilities, you need to obtain spectrum or avail yourself of wholesale arrangements. But one thing I might add quickly is that the other thing we try and do is educate and inform consumers so that they're aware of competitive choices. We've also imposed a wireless code and an internet code on carriers so that they have to interact with their customers in an honest and transparent way, in a way that's easily understood, so that contracts, aren't overly complicated, and all those kinds of mechanisms. So that's meant to empower consumers so that they can find the best price and choose their. I'm a soccer player. I get offended every time I see a red card, Mr. Chair.
Great, thank you.
But you're not disqualified, Mr. Scott. Don't worry.
Okay.
Je me tournerai maintenant, Monsieur Lemire.
Mr. Lemire, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Scott, does the CRTC believe they can implement a Bureau of Expertise that will inspect the network and make sure that the maintenance will be fair towards service providers and those investing in the network?
We have the powers to conduct inspections under the Telecommunications Act, and I may turn to my legal colleague, Anthony, to help me respond to this in a more fulsome way. And we would do inspections in support of an enforcement action or an investigation as required, but we don't routinely go into the field and examine what industry players are doing. Anthony, could you add anything to that?
Thank you. No, I think you covered that quite well. It's not a power that we've used very much.
Alors, c'est une instance pas mal.
So it's something that's quite rare, Mr. Lemire. Okay, so perhaps there's a reflection that needs to be done to continue investing in the network, especially in isolated regions. I'd like to come back on the urgency of ensuring that right now we are in a key time to ensure investment in the network. Summer is coming, and of course it's harder to build during the winter. So on what basis are they negotiating regulations right now with your new framework? What are you suggesting? Mr. Kent, could you answer the question? This is your file. The decision indicates that the parties can negotiate something. They can negotiate if they want to offer something. If they don't want to offer the service, they will have to rate that the modalities will be completed by the Commission. There's a lot of interest. We're aware of that. There's a lot of interest in having access to the service, and we will do our best. Inaudible. Yes, I appreciate that. I appreciate that you're aware of the issue. Is there a program for building towers where a community could invest if they want to have access to a cell network or to a tower? Can we help a community to build a tower? That is not in our regulatory mandate. And now issues linked to towers for broadcast or for wireless services. This is something that's dealt with by industry partners, but there's no regulation against what you're suggesting. Thank you. Mr. Lemire, we've gone over time. Mr. Erskine-Smith, and I'm being told that Mr. Massé has ceded his time but to Mr. Erskine-Smith.
Just to clear up some confusion, because you said, Mr. Scott, a few times that the 2021 wholesale rates decision was a correction. But my reading, the Commission is concerned that completing a fulsome revision would prolong the time period and would require significant resources. So isn't it the case that you identified errors, but you didn't necessarily correct those errors because it would take too much time and cost too many resources? So we still don't really have a good answer, despite two fulsome reviews?
Pardon me. No. What? Sorry, I have an echo. Is that everyone hearing that? Is it gone now? Sorry for the interruption. The reference that you are making relates not to the errors that were made, but how to determine final rates. And effectively, there were two options in front of the Commission. We could have continued and had a cost process, had new costing studies filed in order to continue on this, essentially on the same track, but almost a starting over, which would have taken an extended period of time. And in the Commission,
I understand you spent 3 years to determine one answer, 2 years to determine another answer, and we still don't have an answer. And then in terms of MVNOs, just so I've got it right, there's no active ecosystem of MVNOs because they can't get access to the infrastructure. You say you want more competition, but we're not going to get new competitors coming in to build the infrastructure because we don't have an active ecosystem of MVNOs. So isn't the answer in a short-term way to mandate MVNOs to create that active ecosystem such that there are going to be investors that come forward to build the infrastructure and we don't rely upon the big three and the capture of the big three and the excessive profits and gouging of the big three?
I'm not sure if you wanted me to respond to the first question or the second. I was trying to respond, but I'll try the latter. There is nothing to stop MVNO from going in place. The difference is they're not mandated, other than the ones that we have now put in place, mandating them in specific circumstances. The record of that proceeding showed that rather than contribute to competition, mandating unlimited MVNOs would have detracted from competition and in fact done damage to the existing competitors who are making inroads against the big three and who are having a meaningful impact on wireless rates in Canada. That's why we chose the path we did.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. I will now turn to Mr. Williams for 5 minutes. Mr. Williams, I don't know if I'm the only one, but I can't hear you.
I don't hear anything either, Mr. Chair.
Let's try that again. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's much better.
Thank you, sir. Sorry, Mr. Chair. Mr. Scott, I'm in a rural area. Even though I'm just between Belleville and Toronto, Montreal, and Belleville in Prince Edward County, a lot of my residents still have trouble finding internet. And yet we have rural areas across this whole country. We're the second biggest landmass in the world. Mm-hmm. Is it realistic we'll be achieving full goal of rural connectivity by 2030 with the present players?
My view is yes, it is, and hopefully considerably faster than that. As a number of you have pointed out, there have been considerable funds and effort directed at by all levels of governments to address this problem. There are specific bills going on in addition to what the CRTC is authorizing. And as another member referenced, there is significant development going on with respect to satellite technology. So I would suggest that it's looking positive for reaching all Canadians and bridging the digital divide.
Okay, so I'm going to talk next about speeds. So right now by 2030, the aim is 50 megabytes per second. And just a question, is that not going to put us behind where we need to be in 8 years? For instance, right now, the US average today is 96 megabytes per second download. So is that going to put us behind? I mean, Netflix updates itself every couple months and we're in 4K. Who knows what the next 8K would be, but is that going to be fast enough for Canadians?
Probably not, but it's interesting. I believe the US service level that's mandated is still 25 megabits per second. But all of us are going to have to review this. I would note that it was the CRTC some, I guess, 5 or 6 years ago now that set 5010 as an aspirational target. It wasn't our place to dictate what speeds would be required, but we set it, the commission set it, as an objective that looked forward and seemed to be a reasonable amount. You're quite right. With the evolution of HD and Ultra HD and the amount of video programming, the amount may be, the requirements in the future may be much higher. But indeed, the service offerings that are out there today are up to, and in some cases, exceeding a gig. And many Canadians, particularly during the pandemic, have been increasing the speeds that they subscribe to. I don't know what the average is now, but it's more than 5010.
And I think it's the technology that always doubles. I know it was mentioned today by Madam Lapointe. Starlink is the existing carrier that seems to be dominating the low orbit satellite. I know you've mentioned that. My question is the CRTC looked at if Starlink grabs greater share? First of all, it seems that Starlink is the only carrier out there. Telesat is a Canadian company. We hope to see more. If Starlink gets bigger, CRTC talked about what implication that means for the market and how we're looking at that as a competition level. And the second part of that is, have we looked at pricing for Starlink yet, given that it really has a monopoly in the low orbit satellite right now?
Again, we don't regulate retail internet, so we certainly haven't looked at pricing. Starlink is still predominantly in an experimental phase. It's not available everywhere. It's taking advance orders. We're certainly monitoring their development, as we are Telesat's program and OneWeb's. As to, I can only say that I'm encouraged that there are multiple platforms that are being deployed and that can bring that kind of service to the most isolated areas. It will be the biggest challenge is going to be the last 1 or 2%, and satellite delivered service may be the best technology to get to those places where fiber is not appropriate.
Well, they call it the last mile in broadband. Maybe it's the last frontier for low orbit satellite. But do we have any discussions going on with existing big carriers like Bell and Telus about low orbit satellite? Has that been any discussions at all on that front?
None that I am aware of. Starlink is a direct consumer service. I don't know if OneWeb has announced what its intentions are. My understanding of Telesat service is that they would be wholesaling their capacity to companies, whether it be a small operator or a Bell or a Rogers, whatever. That's my understanding of the proposed business models.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Scott. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. I will now turn to Mr. Fillmore for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Chair. Am I on here? There we go. Thank you. I wanted, if I could, first of all, thank you to the witnesses for your time and joining us today. I want to take us to the land of broadband. We have arrived at a system in Canada now where the large carriers are building the infrastructure, the what's on the poles and so forth. And then there is an ecosystem of smaller, newer carriers that are living on, sort of using that, piggybacking, let's call it, on that infrastructure and charging lower rates. And this is fine. This is a part of the element of competition that we're trying to reach. There's an element of this, though, that the competition is either more or less fair, whether you're in an urban or a rural setting. So in dense urban settings, it's not so much of a bite off of the large carriers' investment in the hard infrastructure, but in the rural areas where the infrastructure, user per kilometer is much lower, that it gets to be a little bit more painful. There's the famous example that's been related to me a few times of in a Canadian rural community where the large company provided the hardwired infrastructure, including into an apartment building, but the enterprising university student living in the apartment building, after having the right business class, created his own carrier and selling the internet service to his neighbors for cheaper than the larger carrier could provide. I just invite you to muse with me about whether there is anything in the CRTC's domain or plans that would help to mitigate some of those variances in, I guess, the degree of competition that emerges that would make it a little bit more fair regarding urban or rural.
I think you accurately described the challenge. In urban areas, there's a bigger market and it attracts more competition. So we have in Canada, if you will, sort of a head start. Many countries only had a wireline telephone system, never had wired cable. We kind of had, and like the US, have two wires in most homes, cable and telephone wires. Then we have wireless on top. And then we have, as you've described, resale, people obtaining access on a wholesale basis to that and reselling it. The challenge in rural areas is there's much less interest, business interest, in competing there. And so a challenge for the CRTC is to figure out what kind of wholesale arrangements are suitable in rural areas that will accomplish both objectives, continuing to see facilities extended to the underserved or unserved, while also supporting competition. And that's a very challenging proposition. One, we'll be looking at the Northwest Tel, the company that provides service to most of northern Canada. We've announced in the coming months and year, and that will be one of the big challenges in that case. So I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but you're absolutely right. Rural areas are more challenging and often need a different approach than urban areas. I hope that answered the question.
It gets there, yeah. Thank you. I guess there's probably another minute or two. But is there anything you mentioned you're going to be watching? Sorry, I missed the name of the
Northwest Tel.
West Tel, thanks. You're going to be watching to see what happens there. But for example, the fund that you administer, is there anything there that would help to close the gap on some of the companies that are providing the stretched out hard infrastructure in rural areas to help them out a little bit?
So in the case of our fund, we're using still what are called hexagons. So basically the rule is if no one in a 25 square kilometer hexagon has 5010 service, then the area is eligible to apply for support from our fund. And we don't care if it's a large or a small player. They have to partner with someone that has experience in deploying facilities, but it's open to Indigenous bands, individual Canadians, municipalities, provincial governments, everybody except the federal government. And if they put in a project that meets the criteria and it compares favorably against others and delivers 5010 service, then we'll consider it and we choose the best ones.
And I guess in northern and remote areas, the adjacency of those hexagons are going to become they're going to be a lot more of them clustered together, and it's going to be hard. So we're going to then turn to the LEOs, the low Earth orbit satellites. Similarly, is there anything in the fund that you administer that supports the filling in of the gaps using low Earth orbit satellites?
Not specific, we're technology agnostic, but it's actually sort of almost the reverse, where there's a concentration. If we take a city like Iqaluit in Nunavut, at least there's a concentration there. You can use various technologies to reach a population. The North is characterized, and other rural parts of Canada, by very spread out population. Satellite may be most useful in reaching dispersed population. I'm getting another red card, so I'm going to stop.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. I appreciate your cooperation. We have time now for an extra round with starting with Mr. Fast for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. Mr. Scott, I want to go back to the wholesale rate reversal decision. One of your predecessors as chair of the CRTC, Conrad van Finkenstein, has said he was shocked the Commission could reverse itself so abruptly on lowering rates. And he said, I quote, "I was stunned by this decision." Why would a former commissioner of the CRTC be so stunned by the reversal decision?
The only answer I could give you is perhaps, pardon me, it's echoing. I can't speak, obviously, for what prompted Mr. von Finkenstein's comment, but what I can say is then I assume he didn't read the decision, nor was he familiar with the record of the proceeding that led to the change.
Well, having gotten to know Mr. Finkenstein a little bit, my guess is he did read the decision. But that said, back in 2019, the government directed the CRTC to look at how to create a more competitive environment. And I believe you suggested that you were moving towards a new wholesale model. And I just want to ask, how's that going? And how quickly do you believe that is going to lower rates for Canadian consumers?
The policy direction, and there are two that are there, are carefully observed by the Commission. And in each decision, you'll see typically at the end of the decision, it will indicate how the Commission considered the policy directions that have been provided to it by the government. In terms of the existing, the ongoing proceedings, as Mr. Kent mentioned earlier, there are several of them. Some of them, the records are complete. Some of them are still in progress. So I can't offer you a time frame for the completion of each of those proceedings. But work and intensify competition and reduce rates goes on constantly and does so today.
Let me ask you another question. Consumers, Canadians who are watching these proceedings, will probably be scratching their heads and asking, okay, in 2016, wholesale rates were established. 2019, the CRTC lowered those wholesale rates, presumably to increase competition, which would come from second-tier telecoms, not the big guys necessarily. And within 2 years, that decision is reversed and the wholesale rates are increased. And I think it's fair for Canadians to ask, how in the world will increasing wholesale rates improve competition and lower the rates that consumers pay?
So in the first instance, we're talking about identifying the costs. There are many elements to the HSA, the Wholesale Access Agreement, technical arrangements, how many points of interconnection, how it works, which facilities are included. So it's a very complex matter and there are multiple elements. The costing of wholesale service is but one. And with respect to overall rates, between 2010 and 2015, rates were going up at a very rapid rate, between 30 and 40%, as I recall. The Commission has taken numerous steps to intensify competition. including the establishment of the current HSA arrangements. And that had the effect of stopping those increases. And rates flattened out, increased slightly sometimes, decreased slightly, and you saw competitors' market share grow, and it has continued to grow. And then we had to make determinations on wholesale costs. So you've said several times, increasing the cost. No, determining the final rates based on costs. And that was what we did. And as I've said several times now, and corrected it.
Mr. Scott, the costs you're referring to are the costs incurred by the big telecoms. Am I correct?
They are the costs establishing the rates that need to be paid to them for the use of those facilities.
So it's the big telecoms that benefit from this decision, correct?
No, well, I don't know how you determine a benefit. The costs relate to their cost structure and establish rates. If you mean that the rates the rates that were could have been in place, remember that they never were actually in place, the earlier rates, would have represented less, a lower rate, a lower wholesale rate. If that's what you mean, that is correct.
Thank you, Mr. Scott, Mr. Fast. I will now turn to Madame Lapointe for 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you.
With my Liberal colleague, Mr. Ernst Smith. Mr. Scott, when in its policy direction to the CRTC in 2019, the government directed the Commission to place high consideration on competition, affordability, consumer interest, and innovation in all of its telecommunication decisions. Can you highlight for us today how the CRTC is making progress in achieving these policy directives?
As I mentioned earlier, the policy directions effectively instruct us to emphasize, to take into careful consideration certain elements of the telecommunications objectives. There's a list of objectives, and they are sometimes, you can read them all together, and they're not all, they're complementary in certain cases, they're contradictory in certain cases. And what the policy direction says is, this is what the government wants you to carefully consider and emphasize. And as I said earlier, we do that, and it's reflected in all of our decisions, where towards the end of the decision, it will spell out how we have applied the existing policy directions to the particular proceeding. So we do in each instance.
Thank you. I've completed my time.
Thank you, Nate.
To pick up on my colleague's question, and Mr. Scott, I've expressed some frustration today, in part because when we talk about the digital divide, and you've referenced closing that gap, do you think it's fair to say that a significant digital divide is not geographic, but based on income?
I suppose you can characterize it that way. I mean, generally, when we use the phrase, we're talking about the availability of service. Obviously, there are additional challenges that go to income levels, but that's not geographic. Obviously, that's in any and all parts
And a digital divide based on income. And it's actually, on some research, more significant a digital divide. And when you have an essential service like internet access, and you're mandated to address competition and affordability, and you've been in the job for over 4 years, and affordability is about addressing that digital divide on income for constituents like mine, what do I tell them that we've accomplished in your 4+ years to reduce rates and make life more affordable and the internet more accessible, that essential service for Canadians in my community?
I should just say in the first instance that it is not about me as an individual, it's about the Commission. Decisions are rendered by all members with the assistance of our staff, as I mentioned earlier.
You are the chair of the organization, though.
I am, and
Yes.
I am one member of a 9-member commission.
Or the chair of an organization, I might not cast it in that way. I might take responsibility for the organization that I chair.
As do I. I'm simply pointing out that decisions of the commission are not mine to make. What we have accomplished is we have continued to further the rollout of broadband services geographically. What we
on
have
income and
accomplished-
affordability, Mr. Scott, on income and affordability for an essential service like the internet.
If you're asking me if we have introduced rate regulation to established rates, as I've already explained, no, we do not. There are a number
My
of
question, I'm just
programs
trying to say, if the mandate is competition and affordability for an essential service like the internet, and you've been in the job for over 4 years, what I see is I see a wholesale rate decision that undercuts competition, as Mr. Fast suggested, and then I see an MVNO decision that very modestly pushes the needle in addressing competition. And after 4+ years, don't you think we should expect more?
I don't have an answer to that. I already answered both questions with respect to MVNO. I have attempted to answer all of your questions with respect to the reconsiderations of the costing
I appreciate
decision.
that, and I express the frustration, and it's not directed at you, it's directed at the institution, and I'll close just with this, because I've been asked by many people, what purpose does the CRTC serve today? And when it comes to the essential service that is the internet and making it more affordable and accessible for Canadians, I'm not sure I have a good answer. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Erskine-Smith. Je passe.
Thank you. Now, we'll go to our last round. Mr. Lemire, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Scott, what is the role of the CRTC in the management of disinformation or false news on the internet? Are you equipped to fight against hate discourse online? I'm not sure I understand your question. Could you repeat your question? For example, Spotify and its online content and what happened. Does your power apply? Does it apply to Spotify or only the license holders?
With respect to the Broadcasting Act, the CRTC really only has available to it 2 approaches to regulation. We can license broadcasters or broadcast distribution or programming undertakings. And otherwise, we use what's called the Digital Media Exemption Order. So a company like Spotify can't be licensed because it is not Canadian owned and controlled, which is a policy direction of the Government Canada to the CRTC under the Broadcasting Act. And that is one of the reasons. So we have jurisdiction over other players under an exemption order. But that is the driving reason for the need for Broadcasting Act reform, to give us clear lines of responsibility over new online players who are involved in broadcasting in Canada, and the necessary tools in order to develop a new regulatory framework.
Last question, Mr. Scott. What are you going to leave as legacy? Your legacy as a chair. What is the thing that you feel that you've been able to change in the landscape of telecommunications in Canada?
I don't view my job that way. I don't think of it. I was asked when I started what was my vision. I suppose I'll be asked what was my legacy. That's the term. Je m'excuse, je connais pas le mot en français. But that's not how I look at it. We deal with matters as they come before us, whether it's application by parties, whether it's initiated by a government or self-initiated. And, you know, it sounds sort of trite, but it isn't to me. We do the best job we can in the public interest. So we develop a record, we ask the important questions, we get submissions from all Canadians, and then we render decisions that we believe are truly in the public interest. That's what a good regulator does, and I hope that's what we have done under my leadership.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Monsieur le Maire.
Merci, Monsieur le Maire.
Thank you, Mr. Lemire. That ends all our rounds of questions. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Scott, on behalf of the committee. Thank you for having taken the time to meet us at the Committee of Industry, you and your team. And on this note, thank you, colleagues, for your cooperation. The meeting is adjourned.
Merci aux traducteurs. Merci beaucoup. Merci. Merci.